I want to start this morning by telling you about a friend of mine. Let's call her Jennifer. Jennifer grew up in a family where there weren't any Christians, and in her early teens, she was invited along to a youth group run by a church by a friend at school. Now, this was a big deal for Jennifer because Jennifer had found, friendships in her early teens quite difficult at times. In fact, the first secondary school that she'd went to, she kind of moved on from because she was being bullied. And so when Jennifer got this invite, that meant a lot to her. And she went along to this youth group, and it was great fun. They played lots of games. But over the weeks and months, there was something else that started having a big impact on her. It was what she was learning about Jesus, who he was, what he did, the difference that he made to people's lives. And after a time there, Jennifer realized that Jesus was really who he said he was, that he was really God's true king, and that she wanted to commit her life to following him. Now, that was a pretty life-transforming thing to happen to Jennifer. And in the following months, she was kind of working out what it meant to kind of live out her newfound faith. And one of the particular things that she started to realize was just how important it was going to be for her to be part of a Christian community. You know, it was one thing for her to go along to a youth group on a Friday night and spend time with people of her own age. But to be a follower of Jesus, that meant to live out her faith in the midst of a Christian community, a church, with people of all sorts of ages and stages. There was just one problem. Jennifer's family, they sometimes went to a very different type of church, a church that didn't really talk that much about Jesus. And Jennifer knew that her parents weren't going to be keen on her going to this new one. What do you do in a situation like that? There might be some of us here this morning who have been in a situation like that. I dare say, in fact, if we're followers of the Lord Jesus and we've been following Jesus for some time, we may think of countless situations where following Jesus means doing one thing, yet people want us to do another thing. It might be people who we know, people that we love, people that we look up to, people that we admire. Maybe even like Jennifer, people who are in authority over us. What do we do in a situation like that? Think of Jennifer. What was she to do in that situation? Well, as we look at 1 Samuel chapter 22 this morning, we're going to see help. We're going to see guidance for situations like that. In fact, more than that, as we look at 1 Samuel chapter 22 this morning, we're going to see what it looks like to live for a false leader, what it looks like to live for a false king. But we're also going to see what it looks like to live for a true king. We're going to see what it looks like to live for Jesus. So if you're taking notes, they're the two big things to look out for. What it looks like to live for a false king, and what it looks like to live for Jesus, our true king. So let's dive in. Since we've picked up our series in 1 Samuel at the beginning of this year, January 2022, we've been watching, haven't we, how the kingdom of Israel is passing from the hands of Saul to David. And at this point in the history of Israel, Saul is still technically the king. But with each week that passes, with each chapter on in the story, it's becoming clearer and clearer, isn't it? That Saul's reign is ending and David is being raised up to be in his place. And Saul has been resisting this, hasn't he? You know, we never stand still in life. That's a good thing for us to know. We're always getting older, aren't we? Our health is always getting better or worse. The money that we have is always going up or down. We never stand still in life. And that's the same for our lives spiritually as well. Because as Saul was resisting God's work in his heart, it was causing all sort of damage to other people and all sort of destruction to himself. 1 Samuel chapter 22, in fact, is really the last time we get a good long look into Saul's heart. We're going to hear about Saul for more chapters to come, but it's this one really that is the last time we get to look in his heart. Why is that? Well, one person that I was reading this week put it like this. They said, after 1 Samuel chapter 22, Frankly, there isn't just that much more to say about Saul. At the end of 1 Samuel chapter 22, Saul is literally on the edge of hell. Let me show you what I mean. Have a look down with me to that little number 26, big number 22, little number 6. And we meet Saul, don't we? He's on the top of this hill, under the shade of this tree with a spear in his hand. Things look pretty king-like. Things look pretty good, right? But as we look a little bit longer, we see that things might not just be quite right. Verse 7, Paul says to these officers standing around him, "Listen, men of Benjamin. Will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards when he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you've all conspired against me? No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me, as he does today." Remember 2 weeks ago, Simon was preaching to us about David escaping from Saul's household, and who was it that helped him? Well, it was Jonathan, Saul's son. Well, in these verses this morning, Saul has just found out about that. And he's not happy. And he's pretty paranoid that there are other things that people aren't telling him. And so Saul tries to buy the loyalty of his people. Do you see that? He offers them the promises of riches and rewards, of power, of commanding these hundreds and these thousands. It's not a good look, is it? When you think about it, the king of Israel, as the king of Israel, Saul was one of God's representatives on earth. And here is Saul trying to buy the loyalty of God's people with cash. Saul doesn't look so much like a true king. He looks more like a false king. Now, none of these Israelite officers are willing to give any more secrets. But there is one person who is. Verse 9, "But Doeg the Edomite was standing with Saul's officers and said, 'I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine.'" Now we're getting a flashback to last week's passage. Remember, as David has now escaped out of the household of Saul with Jonathan's help, and he's on the run. He comes to this place called Nob, where all the Israelite priests are. And David spins the high priest there, Ahimelech, this lie that he's somehow on Saul's mission. And Ahimelech lets David and his men eat the bread of the presence, the bread that's kept in the tabernacle. Even David picks up Goliath's sword. And I don't know if you remember in last week's passage, as Simon was preaching that narrative to us, or stood off in the distance, looking on, is this man Doeg. And what's interesting is in last week's chapter and in this week's chapter, both times, Doeg is referred to as Doeg the Edomite. Now, this might seem like a really small detail, but it's important because the Edomites were the enemies of God's people, that they weren't part of Israel. Now, in the categories of the time, Doeg the Edomite wasn't part of God's people. And so as we stand back and we take in this scene, just think about it. We've got Saul here, the king of Israel, God's people, acting like a king from like all the other nations. Riches and power and money and success. And the only person who's loyal to him is someone from the other nations. Do you see how this view of Saul that we get in these verses isn't Saul as God's true king, but it's Saul as a false king? Now, as I've been thinking about this passage this week and thinking about what it might mean for us all here this morning, well, I've been starting to think about some of the false kings that there are in our lives. I'm not just talking about people who wear crowns and wear big, long robes, but I am talking about those things in our lives that demand first place in our hearts. So, for example, if we're at work, it might be the manager who just demands absolute loyalty over every waking hour. It might be the advert on the TV for that holiday of our dreams, we've got to lay down thousands to get the lasting rest that we're longing for. It might be the pornography website that demands our attention every night before we go to sleep. All sorts of things in our lives, people and places and productions, demanding top spot in our hearts. And the things about these things is that because they demand so much from us, they've got to promise so much for us too, right? Like Saul had to offer so much to these people to buy their loyalty. They offer us the prestige of promotion. They offer us the promise of lasting rest. They offer the fulfillment of our sexual desires. But with such high promises, we've got to ask ourselves, are these things really able to give us the things we long for, the things we all deep down long for, or are they all ultimately fakes? Because the cost is high. In fact, we see that in the rest of our passage. In fact, maybe that was the bit that jumped out at you most of all when we had our reading this morning. Saul now calls Ahimelech to him, doesn't he? And Ahimelech and all of his fellow priests come to Saul, and Saul says, verse 12, little number verse 12, "Now listen now, son of Ahitub." "Yes, my lord," Ahimelech answers. Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me, as he does today?" Now, before moving on, it's worth just noting, Saul jumps to some pretty big conclusions here, right? Sure, Ahimelech may have helped David kind of eating some of the bread, the sword of Goliath, but it doesn't mean that Ahimelech knows that David is rebelling against Saul. In fact, we know that David isn't rebelling against Saul. He's running away from him. Saul's jumping to some pretty big conclusions here, but we've been seeing, haven't we? That's the thing about sin. The more you give your heart over to it, the blinder it makes you. That's what Ahimelech tries saying to Saul. Verse 14, Ahimelech answers the king, "Who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair." Ahimelech's protesting his innocence, yet Saul, with anger burning in his heart, he's just blind to it. And Saul's blindness is about to go off the scale, isn't it? Verse 16, "But the king said, 'You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family.' Then the king orders the guards at his side, 'Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me.' But the king's officials, they're unwilling to give in to Saul's commands. But there's always someone, isn't there? There's always Doeg. The king ordered Doeg, verse 18, 'You turn and strike down the priests.' So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and its women, its children, its infants, its cattle, its donkeys, and its sheep." These verses are awful, aren't they? They're horrific. They're chilling. Here is God's king who is meant to protect God's people, wiping out all of the priests, all of their families, and all of their property. As you've been keeping up with the news this week, no doubt you've been as surprised and as horrified as me to watch on as we've seen President Putin order his Russian troops into Ukraine unprovoked. Well, if we need any further reminder of just where sin can lead you, well, this is where it takes you. It leads to death. And just to think that for Saul, it all started with just a spark of anger in his heart all that time ago, when David came off the battlefield and people were praising his name. What a warning that is to us here this morning. But I think it's also worth, just as we're thinking about this, to not only think about Saul, but to think about Doeg. Because I suspect for many of us, we're not going to have as much authority and as much as power as Saul did. But like Doeg, we will all have people like that calling first place in our hearts. As Doeg answered the demands of Saul, a false king, not God's king, but ultimately led to death. Living for a false king leads to death. That's the first big thing we see from this passage this morning. Living for a false king leads to death. Let me try and apply that a little bit, illustrate it. Well, I mentioned earlier pornography, didn't I? Pornography's been around for a long time, but now with a smartphone in pretty much everyone's pocket, it's more accessible than ever before. During the pandemic, do you know how many adults in the UK watched pornography? Don't know what you'd guess. 50%. 50% of adults engaged with pornography during the pandemic. And it's not just kind of how widespread it is now, it's also kind of people's views towards it. So in a recent survey of young people and their attitudes to pornography, get this, 45% of young people said that pornography is their primary source of sex education. Yet, the thing is, research shows that pornography just isn't good for you. It's not good for your relationships. It hurts other people, and it ultimately causes destruction to your soul. Survey after survey talks about the permanent effect pornography can have on your brain. It also talks about kind of how it can kind of warp your relationships with other people, the effects it can have on your body. So whilst people might more and more be thinking that kind of somehow kind of pornography can help them in their sexual relationships, actually the research shows the more you engage in pornography, the more stability and commitment and satisfaction in sexual relationships actually goes down, not up. Pornography, it destroys ourselves. It destroys our relationships with others. And that, of course, is not to mention the people that we don't know. I don't know if anybody saw this, but in the New York Times at the end of 2020, so December, late on, in December 2020, last year, the New York Times did a big expose piece on the world's biggest pornography website. And the investigative journalist that wrote this piece basically just unveiled how much material on this world's biggest site that either involved people that didn't consent or children and young people. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, there was a massive backlash about this. Huge outcry in the mainstream media. And a result, this pornography website, do you know how much material they had to take down off their site? 9 million videos. That's 70% of all material on there. The overwhelming majority of material on that site, they couldn't be positive, wasn't against people's consent, and didn't involve children and young people. There are many reasons not to engage with pornography, but there's another. And that's the effect that it has on our soul. Jesus, in his famous Sermon on the Mount, you may remember it, he says these words, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Jesus is saying that adultery doesn't just involve kind of sleeping with someone who is married to somebody else. Adultery involves kind of lustfully looking at anyone who we're not married to. And then Jesus goes on to the logical conclusion. He says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Pornography destroys our minds. It destroys other people. It can even destroy our souls. For all the promises that it makes us, what a demand it makes on our life. Living through a false king leads to death. Now, it's worth saying that it's not just pornography that can do great damage in our lives. In fact, living for any false king is ultimately going to lead to that place. But I just wanted to just take a deep dive just for a few minutes because pornography is pervasive in our culture and it could be pervasive in our church. I don't stand here in condemnation. I stand here as a loving pastor. And if you are somebody who experiences this as an issue, can I say to you from personal experience, just stop it. Stop right now. Stop today. From personal experience, I can say that's not going to be easy. You're going to have to lean hard on Jesus. Probably going to have to involve other people, trusted Christian friends who can pray for you, talk with you, support you. We've got some resources. If you're watching online, you can just jump down to the description below our video. There's something there to read, something there to listen to. If you're in the building and you want to get serious with this, as you head home this afternoon, have a look onto our live stream and you'll see it there in the video description. And it's also worth saying that if you're someone here this morning who doesn't look at pornography, maybe you've never even looked at it, please don't think that the last 5 minutes has been a complete waste of time for you. Because this can all be an issue for us. You know, when our eyes linger on the sex scene on that TV program. When we read over that paragraph in the novel that we're reading that talks intimately about intimacy between two people. Maybe even when we're here at church and we're talking to somebody else, and maybe there's someone we know we have a bit of a connection with, particularly if we're married, we have more of a connection with that person than we do with our husband or our spouse. Well, I don't know, that could be on the spectrum too. Living for a false king leads to death. That's the first big thing we see. Living for a false king leads to death. But before finishing up this morning, it's also worth us recognizing this passage isn't just about Saul and Doeg, is it? It's also about David too. And what a massive contrast David is. Because while Saul is at the top of this hill, sunning himself under the shade of this tree with a spear in his hand, well, where's David? Verse 1. Well, David's escaping and hiding in a cave. And it's interesting, isn't it, that whilst people aren't really loyal to Saul, well, more and more people are coming to David. There's David's family, verse 2. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. They probably realized their connection with David is a bit dangerous. David's a wanted man. Saul know about them too. Whilst Saul's family, like Jonathan, are trying to get away from Saul, David's family are trying to come towards him. And in verse 3, we see David take great care of them. He probably knows that maybe they're a bit too old to be running around the Middle East countryside, running away from a king, and so he takes them to Moab, the home of his grandmother Ruth, ensures that they're safe there. While Saul has been throwing spears at his family, David is taking care of his. But it's not just David's family. Verse 2, we read of how all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered round David, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. This shows us, doesn't it, the kind of king God likes, God wants. David doesn't appeal to the people who are rich and powerful, have got it all together. But David markets himself to the people who are needy and know it. And so, when Ahimelech and his family are brutally slaughtered by Saul, and Abiathar, one of his sons, escapes, where is it that Abiathar goes? Verse 20, but one of the sons of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to join David. He told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, I am responsible for the death of your whole family. As Abiathar, no doubt, traumatized by what he's just seen, manages to get away. Where does he go? He goes to David. And what does he find when he comes to meet David? He doesn't find a king who tries to kind of distance himself from this now pretty embarrassing situation for David. David lied to Ahimelech. But David shows great humility. He acknowledges his connection with what's happened. David says to Abiathar, "Stay with me. Don't be afraid. The man who wants to kill you is trying to kill me too. You will be safe with me." You think about Abiathar, on the run, traumatized. Imagine what encouragement those words must have been to him. And so encouraging, not just because of those words, but because of whose lips they were on God's anointed king. Living for a false king leads to death, but living for the true king leads to life. As we've been thinking about some of these false kings that vie for top spot in our hearts, it might be that you're feeling a little bit hopeless, a bit helpless. And you're thinking about the manager you've got at work who does demand unwavering loyalty like over every hour of your waking life. And you might be thinking to yourself, what chance have I got against them? Maybe life's just really tiring right now. You're feeling knackered. The summer holiday that you might have feels like a long way away, and you're thinking, how on earth am I going to get the lasting rest that I want without paying a lot of money and getting a long way away? It might be that you're battling with pornography and you really want to stop. But you're thinking to yourself, what chance have I got against that $100 billion industry? Well, what David said to Abiathar, Jesus says a very similar thing to us this morning. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Jesus says, my yoke is light. If you learn from me, you will find rest for your souls. It was Augustine, the famous North African theologian, who said that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. You see, as we run from these false kings that vie for top spot in our lives, demand so much from us, and we come to Jesus, we find the one who gives us what we long for. We find the one who, deep down, gives us rest for our souls. As we live for the true King, he gives us life. As we finish up this morning, you might be thinking, yeah, James, I get that. Live for a false king, it leads to death. Yep, Saul, Doeg, got it. Live for the true king, Jesus, leads to life. Yeah, I can see that. David. But it could be that just as we're finishing this morning, you're standing back and you're thinking, yeah, but what about Ahimelech? I mean, like, Ahimelech, he wasn't living for Saul, was he? No, if anything, he was standing up against Saul. He was standing for David. He was living for the true king, yet he didn't live. He died. So what's going on there? And if that's a thought that's running through your head, can I first say just thank you? Thank you so much for wrestling hard with this passage. Thank you for wrestling hard with what God might be saying to us through it this morning. And thank you because that question not only gets us right to the heart of 1 Samuel chapter 22, but it gets us right to the heart of what God is doing in the world. Because you see, if you went home this afternoon, if you decided, right, yeah, I'm going to start reading the Bible from the beginning to the end. Say you took 3 chapters a day, 365 days a year. That would get you through the Bible. And if you read 3 chapters a day, starting in Genesis, working your way through, it's not going to take you long to see how God works through the unexpected. In fact, more than that, God brings life even out of death. We sang about it earlier, didn't we? Because as you read and you get to Noah and the flood, You'd read about how the new life he brought out of that. We also sung about it. You hear of Moses and the Passover, Israel's slavery from Egypt, and you think of the life that God brought through that death. You might get further on to the end of the Old Testament, and you read of how Israel were brutally invaded, might sound familiar, taken off in exile to Babylon. Yet under the decree of Cyrus, all those years later, that amazing return to the promised land, God bringing life from death. Because we come then to Jesus, don't we? We read of Jesus, a priest like Ahimelech. We read of Jesus, a prophet, a little bit like this guy Gad, verse 5. Jesus, a king like David. And what does he come and do? He preaches a message, the message which God had given him to do. He speaks up for the poor and the needy, the downtrodden, the burdened. He speaks a message of life and of light, of hope. And he's murdered for it. As he speaks up to false kings, he's put to death, yet he's raised through death to life, so that all who might put their trust in him can experience an eternal life with him. Friends, we come to read a passage like this with Ahimelech, and our instinctive reaction is to think, what an awful way to die. And it was awful, don't get me wrong. What Saul did was wrong, and he will one day give an account to Jesus for that. But do you see, as Ahimelech stood before Saul, a false king, speaking for David, the true king, do you see how Ahimelech was actually experiencing life as it was made to be? And in Christ now, Ahimelech is experiencing eternal life with Jesus for eternity. Living for a false king leads to death. Living for the true king leads to life. At the beginning of our time this morning, I mentioned to you a friend of mine, Jennifer. Stuck in that tricky situation, knowing that living for Jesus meant one thing, but some pretty significant people in her life would want her to do something else. Do you know what happened to Jennifer? Well, as Jennifer was talking this through one day with one of her leaders, her leader said this: Jennifer, what's the most important thing for you? Is it what Jesus thinks of you? Or is it what your parents think of you? And in that moment, Jennifer, she saw it. She saw what it meant to live for the true king. She took a deep breath and went to speak to her parents about him.